71 years old, and on Christmas Eve, my son-in-law handed me a rent bill like I was some stranger renting a room in my own life. The dining room smelled like rosemary turkey, cinnamon candles, and the pine tree Claire insisted on decorating in silver every year because she said gold looked dated. Outside, snow drifted softly across the neighborhood in quiet white waves, covering the sidewalks and mailboxes like a postcard scene from one of those old holiday movies Noel and I used to watch together under wool blankets with mugs of cider in our hands. Inside that house, though, something colder than winter sat at the dinner table with us. Daniel smiled as he slid the folded paper across the polished oak surface toward me. Calm. Casual. Almost cheerful. Since you've been staying here full time, we figured it's fair for everyone to contribute, he said while reaching for his wineglass. His tone sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in the mirror before I arrived. I looked down at the paper without touching it at first. Rent balance, $1,950. Due January 1st. For a moment, all I heard was the soft clink of silverware and the crackling fireplace near the living room archway. Claire kept staring at her plate. My own daughter. 42 years old, wearing the emerald sweater I bought her last Christmas, pretending not to notice the humiliation sitting between the mashed potatoes and the gravy boat. Nobody spoke. Even the grandchildren suddenly seemed quieter, sensing something adults thought they were hiding well. I finally picked up the paper carefully, folding it once more along the crease Daniel had made before sliding it back onto the table beside my untouched glass of iced tea. I see, I said softly. Daniel nodded like he'd just completed a business meeting. Utilities are expensive now, he added. And honestly, groceries too. Groceries. I almost smiled at that part. 3 years earlier, when Claire and Daniel nearly lost this house after his investment partnership collapsed, I was the one who emptied part of Noel's retirement account to help cover their overdue mortgage. $28,000. I never asked for repayment. I told Claire. Family wasn't measured in dollars. Funny how people remember generosity only until it becomes inconvenient. Claire finally looked at me then, but only for half a second. Her eyes carried that same expression she'd worn lately whenever Daniel spoke for both of them, nervous, distant, tired. Mom, it's just temporary, she said quietly. Temporary. Such a harmless word. Like rain delays or power outages. Not exile. Not shame. I nodded once and reached for my purse beside the chair. Of course, I answered. I understand. And I did understand. More than either of them realized. I understood that this dinner had been planned before I arrived. I understood that the bill itself wasn't about money. It was about ownership. Territory. A quiet way of reminding me I no longer belonged at the center of the family Noel and I spent 46 years building together. Daniel relaxed after that. I could see it in the way he leaned back in his chair and reached for another dinner roll. He thought silence meant surrender. People often mistake calmness for weakness. Noel used to warn me about that exact thing. The quiet ones, he'd say, are usually the ones paying closest attention. The Christmas lights reflected softly against the dining room window behind Claire's shoulder, little colored blurs trembling against the dark night outside. I looked at those reflections longer than necessary because suddenly I realized nobody at that table had defended me. Not one person. And somehow, that hurt more than the bill itself. Then Daniel smiled again and said the one sentence that changed everything. Honestly, Evelyn, this arrangement makes the most sense for everybody moving forward. Moving forward. I repeated those words silently in my mind while I reached for my coat. Because less than 48 hours later, my attorney would walk into that same dining room carrying documents Daniel Bennett never saw coming. The roads were almost empty when I drove home that night. Snow drifted lazily beneath the streetlights, covering the quiet suburban neighborhood in a soft white glow that made everything appear peaceful from the outside. I kept both hands on the steering wheel and stared ahead while Christmas songs played faintly through the radio speakers, though I barely heard any of them anymore. My chest did not feel angry. That would have been easier to understand. What settled inside me instead was something colder. Something heavier. The kind of silence that comes after finally seeing a truth you spent years avoiding. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light automatically flicked on, casting pale yellow light across the front steps Noel built himself 20 years ago. He used to joke that no contractor could ever make stairs strong enough for a Harper family Christmas because everybody always arrived carrying too much food and too many opinions. I sat in the car for another minute before turning off the engine. Through the frosted windshield, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. White shutters. Brick chimney. Wreath hanging crooked because Noel never managed to straighten it properly no matter how many times he tried. But the feeling was different now. Houses change once the person who held them together is gone. Inside, the air smelled faintly like cedar and old books. I hung my coat carefully near the doorway and noticed the framed family photo still sitting on the hallway table beside the lamp. Claire was smiling in that picture. Daniel too. That was 6 Christmases ago, before money entered every conversation like an unwanted guest nobody acknowledged directly. Before every favor became a calculation. Before every invitation began to feel conditional. I walked slowly into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. The pecan pie I baked that morning sat untouched inside its glass dish, wrapped neatly in foil. Claire used to beg me to make that pie every Christmas Eve when she was little. She would stand on a chair beside the counter wearing Noel's oversized apron while sneaking brown sugar when she thought I was not looking. I closed the refrigerator gently and leaned against the counter for a moment, suddenly realizing I could not remember the last time my daughter hugged me first without being prompted by guilt or obligation. Somewhere over the years, our conversations had become careful. Measured. Like she was. Always trying to avoid upsetting Daniel rather than speaking honestly. I walked into the living room and sat beside the Christmas tree, letting the lights flicker quietly across the dark walls. The silence there did not feel lonely at first. It felt clarifying. Daniel thought that rent bill humiliated me because he assumed dignity could be reduced to dollars. But humiliation only works when somebody accepts the role being assigned to them. And I did not. I reached for the old wooden box Noel kept beside the bookshelf and opened it carefully. Inside were documents, property records, handwritten notes, and one cream-colored envelope with Margaret Ellis's name written across the front in Noel's unmistakable handwriting. My fingers paused there. I had not opened that box since the funeral 18 months earlier. At the time, grief felt too large to organize into paperwork. But now, sitting alone beneath the glow of the Christmas lights, I remembered something Noel told me during the final winter of his life while we sat together on this very couch listening to snow tap softly against the windows. If people ever start treating you like a burden, he said quietly, promise me you will look at the papers before you believe a word they say. At the time, I thought he was simply worried about me being alone after he passed away. Now I understood there was something else hidden beneath those words. Something he never fully explained. I picked up the envelope slowly and stared at Margaret's name while the clock above the fireplace ticked steadily through the quiet house. Then I smiled for the first time all evening. The next morning, the house felt unusually still. Snow had stopped during the night, leaving the backyard covered in a smooth white blanket untouched except for the faint tracks of a squirrel near the fence line. I woke before sunrise the way I always had during the holidays, out of habit more than necessity. Noel used to laugh because no matter how late we stayed awake wrapping gifts or cleaning dishes after Christmas parties, I would still wake before everybody else and start coffee while the world outside remained dark and silent. Some routines stay alive. Long after the people attached to them are gone. I stood in the kitchen wearing my old wool robe and watched steam rise slowly from my mug while the envelope from the night before rested unopened beside the sugar bowl. Margaret Ellis. Even after all these years, seeing her name brought back memories of hospital waiting rooms, business meetings at our dining table, and quiet conversations between her and Noel that would suddenly stop whenever I entered the room. At the time, I assumed they were discussing taxes or retirement accounts. Noel handled most financial matters himself because he said numbers gave him peace while they gave me headaches. Looking back now, I realized he was not simply organizing money. He was preparing for something. Or perhaps preparing for someone. I finally opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The paper crackled softly beneath my fingers. Evelyn, if you are reading this without me beside you, it means one of two things happened. Either you finally decided to stop avoiding paperwork, or somebody reminded you exactly why I stopped trusting appearances years ago. I stared at those words for a long moment. Outside, pale winter sunlight slowly crept across the backyard fence. The house remained perfectly quiet except for the ticking clock above the stove. Noel's handwriting looked steady and deliberate, each sentence written with the same calm precision he carried through every difficult season of our marriage. He explained that several years before his illness, he transferred the deed of the house, along with portions of his investment holdings, into a protected family trust managed jointly by Margaret and myself. I blinked slowly and read the paragraph twice. My name had been there all along. Not Claire's. Not Daniel's. Mine. Noel wrote that he wanted to make certain nobody could pressure me into selling the property or surrendering financial control during periods of emotional vulnerability. Emotional vulnerability. Such a polite phrase for grief. For loneliness. For becoming old enough that people begin speaking around you instead of to you. Then I reached the sentence that made me sit down completely. Daniel has asked unusual questions about the property more than once. Be careful with men who treat family like a negotiation. My fingers tightened slightly around the paper. Suddenly dozens of small moments from the last few years returned with painful clarity. Daniel casually asking about property taxes during Thanksgiving dinner. Daniel suggesting I move into a smaller condominium for convenience. Daniel repeatedly mentioning how difficult maintenance costs had become in neighborhoods like ours. At the time, each comment sounded harmless on its own. Together, they formed something else entirely. A strategy. I leaned back slowly in the kitchen chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Claire must have known some of it. Maybe not all. But enough. A mother recognizes the difference between discomfort and surprise. Last night at that table, my daughter had not looked shocked. She had looked ashamed. There is a difference. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope before walking into Noel's old study at the end of the hallway. The room still smelled faintly like cedarwood and coffee. His reading glasses remained exactly where he left them beside the desk lamp 18 months earlier. I sat down slowly in his leather chair and opened the bottom drawer where he kept important documents. Inside, beneath neatly labeled folders, rested a business card with Margaret Ellis's direct office number written in blue ink across the back. I picked up the phone without hesitating this time. Because for the first time since Noel died, I finally understood something clearly. Daniel Bennett had mistaken grief for helplessness. And that was about to become a very expensive mistake. Margaret Ellis answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded exactly the same as it had 20 years earlier when she and Noel used to sit at our dining table discussing contracts while I brought them coffee and lemon cookies from the bakery down the street. Calm. Precise. Impossible to rush. Evelyn, she said gently after a brief pause. I wondered when you might call. I stared out the study window at the snow-covered backyard while tightening my grip on the phone. You knew, I said. Quietly. It was not an accusation. Just a realization finally spoken aloud. Margaret exhaled softly on the other end. Noel hoped he was being overly cautious, she replied. But he trusted his instincts. I lowered myself slowly into the leather chair behind Noel's desk. Papers remained stacked neatly in labeled trays exactly as he left them, as though he might walk back into the room any minute carrying one of his heavy wool coats and complaining about winter traffic. Grief does strange things to time. Some days 18 months felt like a lifetime. Other days it felt like Noel had only stepped outside for groceries. Margaret asked me a few careful questions about the dinner, about Daniel, about the sudden rent demand. She never interrupted once while I explained everything. When I finished speaking, silence settled briefly between us. Then she said something that made the entire room seem colder. Evelyn, there is more happening here than a family disagreement. My eyes moved slowly toward the folder drawer Noel kept locked for years. What do you mean? I asked. Margaret hesitated only slightly before answering. 3 months ago, Daniel contacted a real estate consultant regarding your property. My stomach tightened immediately. That is impossible, I said. The house is protected. Yes, she replied calmly. which is likely why he never moved forward formally. But according to the inquiry records, he was exploring estimated resale value projections and potential redevelopment interest in your neighborhood. I closed my eyes for a moment. Redevelopment interest. Such polished language for people waiting for widows to disappear so older homes could become profitable again. Suddenly Daniel's comments over the past year replayed differently in my memory. The way he constantly talked about rising market values. The articles he forwarded Claire about downsizing after retirement. The overly casual questions about whether maintaining a large property alone felt exhausting. None of it had been random. Every conversation had been testing boundaries. Measuring weakness. Claire knows something, I whispered more to myself than to Margaret. Probably pieces of it. She answered carefully. But I do not believe she understands the full legal structure Noel established. I opened the bottom drawer slowly and removed another folder labeled Harper Family Trust. Inside were signatures, notarized documents, property maps, and financial statements I had never fully reviewed after Noel passed away because I trusted him completely. Now I understood why he insisted the paperwork remain untouched unless absolutely necessary. He was not hiding control from me. He was protecting it for me. Margaret's voice softened slightly. Evelyn, your husband created multiple safeguards. Nobody can force you out of that house. Nobody can charge you rent there. Legally, Daniel has no authority whatsoever. I looked down at my hands resting quietly against the desk. Strange how humiliation loses its power once truth enters the room. The rent bill suddenly seemed smaller now. Almost desperate. Like the move of someone growing impatient after subtle manipulation failed to produce results. What happens next? I asked. I could hear papers shifting faintly through Margaret's phone line before she answered. That depends entirely on how much Daniel believes you still do not know. A slow smile touched my face before I even realized it. Outside, snow slid softly from the tree branches beside the fence, disappearing silently into the white ground below. Then perhaps, I said quietly, we should let him keep believing that a little longer. Margaret laughed softly for the first time during the call. Noel would have enjoyed hearing you say that. After we hung up, I remained seated in the study for a long while, surrounded by the quiet weight of old paper and fading winter sunlight. Then I opened the folder again and noticed a handwritten note clipped to the final page in Noel's careful block lettering. If kindness ever becomes invisible to them, do not beg to be seen. Let consequences introduce themselves instead. The strange thing about betrayal is that once you finally recognize it, you start noticing how long it has actually been sitting beside you unnoticed. Over the next few days, I stopped arguing with memories and simply began observing them. Quietly. Carefully. Like Noel used to study weather patterns before deciding whether to drive during winter storms. The signs had always been there. I just kept translating them into kinder meanings because that is what mothers do when they love their children more than they protect themselves. 2 days after Christmas, Claire stopped by unexpectedly around noon. She carried a container of leftover sweet potato casserole and wore oversized sunglasses even though the sky outside remained cloudy and pale. I thought you might want this, she said while standing awkwardly near the doorway. Her voice sounded overly bright, like someone trying to keep a fragile object from breaking. I stepped aside and let her enter without comment. The house smelled faintly like coffee and lemon polish from the morning cleaning I had done simply to keep my hands occupied. Claire placed the casserole dish on the kitchen counter and glanced around the room carefully. Not nostalgically. Assessing. That was when I noticed it fully for the first time. She looked at the house the same way Daniel did now. Not as a home filled with memories. As an asset. The driveway really needs resurfacing soon, she said casually while removing her gloves. Daniel noticed some cracking near the garage. I continued wiping the counter slowly with a dishcloth. Did he? I replied. Claire hesitated before sitting at the kitchen table. Silence settled between us for several seconds. I could almost see her searching for safe conversational ground that would not lead back to Christmas Eve. Finally she sighed softly. Mom, Daniel did not mean to upset you. There it was. Not an apology. A negotiation. I folded the dishcloth neatly beside the sink before turning toward her. No? I asked gently. Claire lowered her eyes immediately. That small reaction told me more than words ever could. She knew exactly how cruel it had been. But somewhere along the line, keeping peace with her husband had become more important than protecting dignity within her family. Things have just been stressful lately, she continued quietly. Property taxes went up again. The market is changing. Daniel is trying to think long-term. Long-term. Another polished phrase people use when they want selfishness to sound responsible. I walked to the refrigerator and placed the casserole inside without responding right away. Noel always believed silence revealed more than confrontation because nervous people rush to fill empty space with truth they never intended to say aloud. Claire proved him right almost immediately. You know how expensive this neighborhood has become, she added carefully. Most people your age are downsizing now anyway. My hand paused briefly against the refrigerator door. There it was at last. Not hidden behind kindness anymore. Not softened beneath concern. The real conversation. I closed the refrigerator gently and turned back toward my daughter. For a moment, I saw flashes of the little girl who used to run through this kitchen in socks too large for her feet while Noel chased her holding pancake batter. I remembered school lunches packed before sunrise. Piano recitals. Fevers. Broken hearts. Mothers spend decades building emotional shelter for their children, never imagining one day they may stand outside that shelter themselves. Claire looked uncomfortable beneath my silence. I am just saying maybe simpler would be better, she whispered. Simpler. Smaller house. Smaller presence. Smaller life. I walked slowly to the kitchen table and sat across from her. Then, for the first time since Noel died, I decided not to protect someone else from discomfort. Claire, I said calmly, did Daniel tell you he researched selling this property months ago? The color drained from her face so quickly she did not even realize her mouth had fallen slightly open. And in that instant, I finally understood something painful but necessary. My daughter had not been fully honest with me for a very long time. Claire stared at me across the kitchen table like the room had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. For several long seconds, she said nothing at all. Her fingers tightened slowly around the handle of her coffee mug, and I noticed the tiny tremor in her hand before she quickly placed the cup back onto the table. That reaction alone answered more questions than words ever could. Mom, she began softly, but the sentence never fully formed. I watched her carefully, not with anger anymore, but with something quieter. Recognition. The painful kind that arrives when denial finally grows too heavy to carry. Outside the kitchen window, snow continued melting from the tree branches in slow drops beneath the pale afternoon sun. Everything felt strangely calm considering how much had just changed between us. How long have you known? I asked gently. Claire looked down immediately. It was not like that, she whispered. Not like that. People say those words when they know exactly what that really is. I folded my hands neatly on the table and waited. Noel always believed silence forced honesty into the open eventually. He was right again. Daniel was only exploring options, Claire said after another long pause. Nothing was finalized. I nodded once. Options for what? She swallowed visibly before answering. For the future. There was that phrase again. The future. Such a clean, polished word for removing someone quietly from the center of their own life. Claire finally lifted her eyes toward me, and for the first time in years, I saw exhaustion behind them instead of defensiveness. You do not understand how stressed things have been, she said quietly. Daniel lost so much money after the partnership collapsed. We are still trying to recover. I almost smiled at the irony. Recover. As though the answer to financial insecurity was taking control of a widow's home. Claire, I said softly, your father already helped Daniel recover once. Her expression flickered instantly. Shame. Memory. Guilt. All at once. That was different, she replied too quickly. Was it? I asked. The room fell silent again. I stood slowly from the table and walked toward the sink, rinsing my untouched coffee cup beneath warm water while gathering my thoughts carefully. Anger would have been easy now. Dramatic. Loud. But loud people reveal too much too early. Calm people learn things. Did Daniel know about the trust? I asked without turning around. Claire hesitated too long before answering. No, she finally admitted. At least. I do not think so. I dried the cup carefully with a dish towel and placed it back inside the cabinet. Then I looked at my daughter again, studying the tired lines around her eyes that had deepened over the past few years. Somewhere beneath all the manipulation and avoidance, she still looked like a woman carrying more fear than certainty. Claire, I said quietly, does your husband love you, or does he love security? Her face tightened immediately. That is not fair. No, I replied calmly. What happened at Christmas dinner was not fair. She looked away again after that. The truth has weight to it. Even before people admit it aloud, their bodies start struggling to carry it comfortably. After another minute, Claire stood slowly and reached for her coat draped over the chair. Daniel thinks you resent him, she murmured near the doorway. I almost laughed at that. Resentment requires emotional investment. What I felt now was something colder. Clarity. Tell Daniel not to worry, I answered softly. I finally understand him perfectly. Claire froze briefly at the front door, like she wanted to say something else. Maybe apologize. Maybe confess more than she intended. But in the end, she simply nodded once and stepped outside into the fading afternoon light. I watched through the window as she walked carefully down the driveway toward her car, shoulders tense beneath her wool coat. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten quietly. Daniel was sitting inside the passenger seat waiting for her. He had not even trusted her to come alone. The engine started moments later, and the car disappeared slowly down the street beneath the melting snow while I stood silently in the kitchen Noel built 40 years earlier with his own hands. Then I walked calmly back to the study and called Margaret again. I think, I said quietly after she answered, it is time we let Daniel believe he is winning. The following week, I became someone Daniel no longer viewed as a threat. That was the first real advantage I had. People reveal themselves carelessly once they believe you are emotionally defeated. I stopped questioning anything directly after that conversation with Claire. I answered texts politely. I returned phone calls calmly. When Daniel mentioned finances, I nodded with quiet understanding instead of resistance. By New Year's Day, he had already begun relaxing around me again. I could hear it in his voice. Confidence returning. Control settling back into place. Margaret called every evening around 7, usually while I sat beside the fireplace with Noel's old wool blanket folded across my lap. Together we reviewed documents, timelines, trust provisions, and records connected to the property. The more I learned, the clearer everything became. Noel had protected nearly every major asset years before his illness worsened. The house itself belonged entirely to the Harper family trust, and according to the structure Margaret helped create, no transfer or sale could happen without my direct authorization and legal review. Daniel had spent months trying to pressure someone who legally controlled far more than he realized. But Margaret warned me repeatedly not to confront him too soon. Greedy people become careless when they believe they are close to getting what they want, she said during one call. Let him keep talking. So I did. 3 days later, Daniel invited me to dinner again. The message arrived just after noon. Family dinner Friday night. Thought we could discuss practical solutions moving forward. Practical solutions. I almost smiled reading it. Even now, he framed manipulation like responsibility. Friday evening arrived cold and grey, with freezing rain coating the roads in thin layers of ice that reflected the headlights of passing cars. I wore the pearl earrings Noel gave me on our 40th anniversary and drove slowly across town while soft jazz played quietly through the radio. By the time I arrived, warm yellow light glowed through Claire's front windows, and the smell of garlic and roasted chicken drifted through the house when Daniel opened the door. Evelyn, he said warmly, smiling wider than usual. Glad you made it. He had entered the charming phase again. The polished businessman version of himself. The one that appeared whenever he needed cooperation. Claire hugged me quickly near the kitchen, though her shoulders still carried tension she could not fully hide. Throughout dinner, Daniel remained unusually attentive. He refilled my iced tea before I asked. Complimented the scarf I wore. Even asked questions about Noel's old woodworking projects as though trying to rebuild emotional goodwill brick by brick. I answered pleasantly while watching him carefully across the candlelit table. There is something unsettling about observing someone perform kindness strategically. Halfway through dessert, Daniel finally leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. I have been thinking a lot about your situation, he began carefully. Situation. Another interesting word. People only use it when trying to reduce someone's life into a manageable problem. You should not have to carry the burden of maintaining such a large property alone, he continued. Especially at this stage of life. Claire stared silently at her plate again. I noticed she barely touched her food all evening. I appreciate your concern, I replied softly. Daniel nodded like a patient advisor guiding a difficult client. Actually, he said, reaching toward a leather folder resting beside his chair, I spoke with someone who specializes in retirement transitions. There it was. The real purpose of the dinner. Not family. Not reconciliation. Paperwork. He slid several documents carefully across the table toward me with the same smooth confidence he carried on Christmas Eve. Nothing official yet, he said casually. Just preliminary ideas that could simplify things for everybody. I looked down slowly at the pages. Assisted living brochures. Property evaluation estimates. Preliminary transfer consultation forms. My fingers rested lightly against the edge of the paperwork while the room remained completely silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Then I lifted my eyes calmly toward Daniel and smiled softly enough to make him believe exactly what I wanted him to believe. Perhaps, I said quietly, you should invite me back next week so we can discuss everything properly. The relief on his face appeared instantly. And in that moment, I knew Margaret had been right. Daniel Bennett truly believed the house was already halfway his. The second dinner invitation arrived exactly 4 days later, just as Margaret predicted it would. Daniel chose Sunday evening this time. More formal. More deliberate. Claire texted me separately that afternoon asking if I wanted her to pick me up because freezing rain was expected again after sunset. I declined politely. Something told me I needed to arrive alone. When I pulled into their driveway that evening, every light inside the house was glowing brightly against the dark winter sky. Through the front window, I could already see the dining room table fully set with wine glasses, folded linen napkins, and the expensive silver candle holders I gave Claire as a wedding present 15 years earlier. Daniel opened the door almost immediately after I rang the bell, as though he had been watching for my car. Perfect timing, he said warmly while helping me remove my coat. We were just about to sit down. We. Interesting word considering the atmosphere inside the house felt less like a family dinner and more like a scheduled presentation. Claire hugged me softly near the staircase, but her expression looked strained. Nervous. Behind her eyes, I could see the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent too long trying to keep two incompatible realities from colliding. Dinner itself passed almost too smoothly. Daniel remained charming throughout the meal, telling stories about business opportunities returning in the new year and joking with the grandchildren loudly enough to create the illusion of normalcy. Every movement felt carefully managed. Every smile slightly overperformed. Meanwhile, Claire barely spoke at all. Around dessert, Daniel finally placed his napkin neatly beside his plate and leaned forward with practiced seriousness. I have been reviewing some options that could really protect everybody long-term, he began. There was that phrase again. Protect everybody. Greed often disguises itself as responsibility because selfish people like believing they are rational rather than cruel. Daniel reached beside his chair and lifted a thick folder onto the table. Far more paperwork this time. Official documents. Tabs. Signatures marked with yellow stickers. He slid the folder carefully toward me while maintaining steady eye contact. This is simply a proposed transition agreement, he explained smoothly. It would allow us to help manage the property and eventually ease you into something more practical without unnecessary stress. I opened the folder slowly. Transfer consultation forms. Residency agreements. Financial management authorizations. Temporary occupancy language. The wording was polished carefully enough that someone overwhelmed by grief or pressure might not fully understand what they were surrendering. But I understood perfectly now. Daniel was not trying to help me move. He was trying to position himself between me and everything Noel spent a lifetime building. You can take time reviewing it, Daniel added confidently. But honestly, this is probably the smartest path forward for everyone involved. Everyone involved. I almost admired how consistently he framed personal ambition as collective benefit. The room remained very quiet after that. The grandchildren had already gone upstairs, leaving only the soft ticking of the dining room clock and the faint crackle of the fireplace from the living room nearby. Claire stared down at her folded hands while Daniel waited for my reaction with the calm patience of a man convinced the outcome had already been decided. I closed the folder gently and rested both palms on top of it for a moment before lifting my eyes toward him. Then, without the slightest change in my expression, I said the sentence Margaret and I had prepared carefully together 2 nights earlier. Before I sign anything involving family property, I said softly, my attorney insists on reviewing all documentation personally. For the first time all evening, Daniel's smile faltered slightly. Only for a second. But I saw it. Attorney, he repeated casually, though the confidence beneath his voice shifted almost immediately. I nodded once. Margaret Ellis. The silence that followed felt completely different from the silence during Christmas dinner. Back then, I was the only person at the table who did not understand what was happening. Now I was the only person who did. Claire. Looked up sharply the moment Margaret's name left my mouth. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, his fingers tightening almost invisibly against the stem of his wineglass. And suddenly, for the very first time since Noel died, nobody at that table looked comfortable anymore. Daniel recovered quickly after hearing Margaret's name, but not completely. That was the interesting thing about confident people. The moment certainty cracks, even slightly, they begin over-explaining themselves without realizing it. He leaned back in his chair and forced a relaxed smile while adjusting the cuff of his shirt. Of course, he said smoothly. I completely understand wanting legal review. But his voice no longer carried the same effortless confidence from earlier in the evening. Claire noticed it too. I could tell by the way her eyes moved carefully between us now, no longer avoiding the tension sitting openly at the table. I folded the paperwork neatly closed and rested it beside my plate. Margaret will probably want copies of everything, I added softly. Daniel nodded too quickly. Absolutely. Transparency is important. Transparency. Another polished word that sounds noble until somebody actually asks for it. The fireplace crackled faintly in the next room while freezing rain tapped softly against the dining room windows. Nobody reached for dessert anymore. Daniel cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the conversation. Honestly, Evelyn, this is really about protecting you in the long run, he said. Managing a property like yours alone at your age can become overwhelming very fast. I looked at him quietly for several seconds before answering. Interesting, I replied gently. Considering the property is not actually mine alone. The room went still. Claire's eyes lifted toward me immediately. Daniel's expression barely changed, but I noticed his hand pause against the stem of his wineglass again. Small reactions reveal more than dramatic ones ever do. What do you mean? He asked carefully. I reached into my purse slowly and removed a cream-colored folder Margaret prepared earlier that afternoon. Nothing thick. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. I placed it calmly onto the table between us. Noel established legal protections years ago, I said softly. The house belongs to the Harper Family Trust. Silence. Real silence this time. Not awkwardness. Shock. Claire stared at the folder like she suddenly understood why her father spent so many evenings behind the closed study door handling paperwork alone. Daniel blinked once before forcing another smile. Well, he said lightly, that still does not really change the practical realities. I almost admired the persistence. Even cornered people continue searching for exits. Actually, I answered calmly, it changes every practical reality. Then I opened the folder. Inside were certified trust summaries, property ownership documents, and legal authorization statements carrying Margaret Ellis's signature beneath Noel's original filings. Daniel's face slowly lost color as he scanned the first page. He read more carefully after that. Much more carefully. Gone was the charming tone. Gone was the polished confidence. Now he looked like a man realizing the floor beneath him had never belonged to him in the first place. Claire finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad did this before he got sick. I nodded once. Your father understood people very well. Daniel continued turning pages, though more slowly now. This says the property cannot be transferred without trustee approval, he muttered quietly. Correct, I replied. And Margaret informed me someone already explored redevelopment inquiries regarding the house several months ago. That landed exactly where I intended it to. Daniel looked up sharply. For the first time since I met him 15 years earlier, he had absolutely nothing prepared to say. Claire stared at him in complete disbelief. You contacted developers, she asked quietly. He immediately straightened in his chair. It was preliminary research, he answered defensively. I was trying to think ahead financially. There it was again. Financially. Every explanation eventually revealed what mattered most to him. I closed the folder gently and slid it back toward myself. Daniel, I said softly, there is a difference between helping family and positioning yourself around their grief. He looked away first. Not me. Him. Outside, freezing rain continued coating the quiet neighborhood streets while the dining room clock ticked steadily against the wall behind Claire's chair. Strange how differently silence feels once truth finally enters the room. A week earlier, they had handed me a rent bill believing I was fragile enough to accept whatever role they assigned me. Now nobody at that table seemed certain who held power anymore. Then I stood slowly from my chair, gathered my purse, and slipped the folder carefully beneath my arm. Tell the children I said goodnight, I said calmly. Claire looked like she wanted to stop me, apologize, explain something, maybe even cry. But I was too tired for emotional negotiations now. Some betrayals do not break your heart all at once. They simply remove your illusion one careful layer at a time until clarity is all that remains. And clarity, I had finally learned, can be far more peaceful than denial.